Hello and welcome to our weekly conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Naseem Ahmed and my guest today is Kaleem Hussein, author of a new book titled Peace and Reconciliation in International Law and Islamic Law, focusing on the conflicts in Afghanistan, Kashmir, and of course, Israel and Palestine. The book examines and analyzes the conflicts through the prism of international law, humanitarian norms, treaties, and conventions, with insights from Islamic legal traditions. As you can probably gauge from the description I've just given, it's an innovative approach to the problem of conflict resolution, which is why I wanted to speak with Kaleem, especially to get his thoughts and insight on Palestine. It's great to have you on the show, Kaleem, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on your show. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Kaleem is a British writer, author, consultant, and geopolitical observer with an interest in the intersection of religion in public life, politics, and international relations. He is an Honorary Fellow at the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion, University of Birmingham, UK, at the Foundation for Science, Technology, and Civilisation. He is a Fellow at the Royal Society of Arts, a Global Diplomatic Forum alumni, and a Risk Assistance Network exchange expert. That's quite a lot you've packed in, Kaleem. I'm sure you can shed light and bring all those expertise into our conversation today when we speak about conflict resolution and in particular Israel Palestine. So as I mentioned, I mean, you have a very broad experience. But what inspired you to write this book, and what do you hope readers will take away from it?
Thank you very much for the question. What inspired me to write the book was that when I looked around the world today and I looked at, the multiple conflict theaters around the world, we have the situation in Syria, we had the Yemen, and the international analysts and observers use the term what they call forever wars or never-ending wars. These have been going on for many years and there just seems to be no end in sight. So I wanted to kind of analyze these situations and then also realize that many of the conflict hotspots around the world, historically in recent years, places that we had like Afghanistan, we had Iraq, they tend to be Muslim majority countries. So that was one of the main kind of triggers that made me think, with my background in international law, international relations, that why is it, first and foremost, why is it there are always Muslim majority countries that seem to be at the back end of having immersed in these conflicts? And then we have within the corpus of the international rules-based order an international legal structure that is there as a framework to manage and deal with conflicts and provide timely resolutions. So that was one aspect. But then because of the fact that many of these are Muslim majority countries, and obviously Islamic law plays a pivotal role in many of these countries in different ways, either at the human level or even sometimes in the jurisdictional and the constitutional frameworks that exist there. So that was something that triggered me first to say, when we have an international legal structure, what are the similarities and the differences that exist between the Islamic system and the international legal structure, and how can that be used potentially as a facilitator to broker resolutions or peaceful resolution in these theaters, especially with the read that those that feel that they are bound by these rules. So that was one of the first kind of trigger points to stimulate me to write this. And obviously, you can, when you look at the world, there's multiple conflict theaters, and there's only so much one can focus on. So for the purpose of my book, I focused on three theaters, which you kind of alluded to at the beginning, which was the Kashmir situation, the Afghanistan situation, and then the Palestine-Israel. And one of the kind of defining kind of modalities as to why I've done that was, obviously I felt that Islamic paradigms play a pivotal role there. And although obviously there was other theaters, just due to confining a space and the time I had that I focused on these particular regions.
I mean, it's quite sorry, yeah. No, I mean, maybe it's just a coincidence that you said that Islamic law plays a pivotal role. I mean, when it comes to Israel Palestine, oftentimes we will dismiss religion and we'll say this is not religious conflict. This is a conflict about states and nations, which is of course true, but there is a push from the Israeli side. I mean, there was an article this week in the Times of Israel, which encouraged Israelis to think about the conflict in religious terms. He said,
Indeed.
we need to find a halaikic solution, which is basically Jewish law, law of the religious Jewish law, to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. So there's a danger in moving forward and thinking in that way. Of course, we don't want to encourage the idea that this is a religious conflict, and there is a push in Israel now to define this as a religious conflict, especially given the fact that far-right extremists, many of whom come from the religious fringes in Israel, are in government. So there's a danger in doing that, and I think we'll get to that later on. But broadly, can you just give for us an overview of the book for viewers who may want to buy and read your book?
Yeah, so thank you. So I mean, all the points you touch on are obviously covered. Is vis-a-vis the Palestine-Israel situation, as you alluded to. But the overview was that my methodology was to first and foremost, for the readers, to give them an overview of the international legal framework, around conflict resolution, and then it's vast. Obviously, we have international humanitarian law, we have United Nations structures, we have international criminal court structures that govern the whole modalities of the interactions between states and how they should go. Kind of deal with their affairs on a bilateral level, on an international level, on a multilateral level, etc., etc., etc. So there's a whole canopy, what you call a system there. So that was the first foremost kind of objective. And then within the international rules-based structure, we have principles of human rights, we have principles of justice, we have principles of preemptive strike. Which came about in recent years in some of the interventions that took place. We have the principle of self-defense. So all of a sudden you realize that within the canopy of the rules-based structure, these frameworks are there. And then what I try to do in the second chapter is to look at the principles of international, what you can really term international Islamic law, in terms of the model that exists, and with that you find again principles of adl that exist, principles of humanity, principles of mercy that are intertwined in there, the rules and engagements of war in terms of when can states go into war, the principle of self-defense, the principle of jihad is covered in as from a lexical perspective, from a a jurisprudential perspective. I think because a lot of misunderstanding for a lot of audiences out there when you use the word jihad, it's a loaded term, but I cover that in a classical perspective to to inform the reader that what its kind of true holistic meaning is from a traditional Sharia perspective. And then even the kind of principles around the evidential burden, around preemptive strike, that is also covered from a kind of Sharia paradigm perspective. And what I do in that chapter is, first and foremost, obviously it's pretty much a clear kind of analysis of the two different systems, and then in the third chapter, what I do is I look at the synergies, as in what are the similarities and the differences between the two systems in terms of the way they go about dealing with conflicts, and are there certain elements where maybe one could be seen a bit more preferential or than the other. And then the fourth chapter of my book is the selected theaters, which we just talked about. I look at how using this model, if you were to apply it in practice in some of these scenarios, would it help or hinder the process of peace and reconciliation? And that was the kind of the whole kind of the modus operandi of the crux of what my book was about. And then the final chapter is my kind of concluding thoughts around it, and also looking at it from kind of international rules-based structure, looking at the United Nations structure, even some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, humanitarian norms, etc., etc. So without kind of giving out everything about the book, hopefully I want the readers to read it. This is the kind of the essence and the model that I used to write this book. And also, just as a final kind of snippet here, is that understanding that the world is not just based on Islam. There's a multi-faith paradigm that exists globally, people of different faith traditions. So I do cover a section around what I term as theo-diplomacy, which is something slightly innovative out there in terms of what I proclaim in terms of that needs to be utilized in a more effective way in terms of our diplomacy, in terms of the interlocutors that are out there, and the brokering and facilitating of peaceful resolution to outcomes or conflicts when they arise. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious question would be, when it comes to Israel and Palestine anyway, I mean, law is pretty much clear on this. There is international law prohibits, for example, annexation. The right of victors is not something which is permitted under international law. Law is also pretty clear when it comes to refugees. That there is, 6 billion Palestinian refugees. So on various issues, I would say on the key issues, what we call the final status issues, law is very clear on Israel-Palestine. So when you looked at this particular conflict, where is the failing? Is it a failing in law implementation, imagination, or is there a dimension that needs to be brought in to our understanding of the conflict? In your case, you may say, bring in the Islamic dimension. What is the dimension? Do we need to bring in another dimension to help us think through what has been 70 years of Israeli occupation?
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, just as an anecdote, I spoke to a lot of interlocutors, people who are engaged in conflict resolution and even non-violence activism regarding the even situation like the Israel-Palestine situation. And what was readily apparent when I was looking into this is that you cannot have an absolutist model. Yes, Islamic paradigms exist in terms of the Islamic law also has a role to play in Palestine-Israel situation. But when you look at these conflicts through an absolutist paradigm, it does not work. So in terms of what are the kind of failings, first and foremost is one of them is a disregard of the law. As we just talked about, there's international laws that give the usurpation of property, the property rights, human rights, land rights, the freedom of movement, the status of people that reside in Palestine, Israel. What is their status in terms of equal citizenship? So all these elements are gradually being dwindled over the years, and some of the acts that the settler organizations are doing, these are groups which are really on the extreme right, of the political spectrum, and probably even further in terms of some of the things that they're doing. And then the sanctity of what you call, we talk about the political dimensions, but the religious aspect comes to it in the sense that one of the holiest sites exists in this region, for the Abrahamic faith traditions primarily, and the sanctity of these sites is held in the highest esteem across the faith traditions. So when these sacred sites are violated, for example, the Masjid al-Aqsa, we have recent episodes where the settler groups come in and do the activities there, and then even the religious law states that the prayers are exclusively for people from the Muslim faith background in the Masjid al-Aqsa compound or the Masjid al-Aqsa, the vicinity, and yet other groups are coming in and starting to do activities or acts of prayers which are again in violation of the agreements that exist.
I would say inciting. I'll probably use the term inciting
so
violence.
Whereas you're allowed to visit there, that's perfectly fine. But when you engage in these kind of activities, then all of a sudden you are, as you mentioned, you are inciting and creating an antagonistic environment and purposefully, triggering the likelihood of a reaction, when technically that should not be even happening based on the legal structure that have been agreed, and the formality there. So these are little subtleties on the ground which are not helping the situation at all. So I think what would help upmost is that respect, mutual respect for the other, based on equal rights and citizenship, and that is fundamental. And the taking of land that belongs to in conventional legal terms, there's a term called what they call a squatter. So if I go into somebody else's property or land and I stay there illegally, that's called a squatter. And yet sometimes what happens in law is that after 10, 50 years, if that person stays long enough, sometimes they're given the rights to stay there. But it doesn't mean to say that overall that is right. And this is what has been happening for decades. And this is something in international legal law structure, even from an Islamic law perspective in terms of property rights, those people and the land rights for those who it belongs to, that it should belong to them, and this is sadly being revoked and abused. So these are some of the kind of subtleties that need to be addressed. But then when it comes to the political sphere, the imbalance of power dynamic that exists in this conflict is readily apparent. And we have people like, I think one of the scholars I have, Al-Kindi, he talks about it in The Blind Spot, the book that is written. And he talks about, that it's because of this balance in power dynamic that we are not seeing a speedy resolution to this conflict. And obviously, some of the people that have been engaged in the conflict to broker, we have obviously the United States of America, who have been heavily involved over the years in any kind of negotiations and so forth. And the argument is that, well, to date, it's not really been effective. As we can see, in the last few years, we had the situation with the Abrahamic Accords. Again, the deal of the century, which Trump talked about, but for many, it was not the deal of the century. When you looked at it, in great detail into the rights that it was giving to the Palestinians. And then we have in international, a lot of international organizations like Amnesty International, further other, UN groups that have written reports talking about, sadly, what we have today is what we're heading towards, like an apartheid structure. And these are not helping. So I think it's about realizing that it has to be based on justice, human rights, and citizenship, based on equality of citizenship of people that live there. That is fundamental, because at the moment it seems as if that there's a gross imbalance in that dynamic today. Yeah.
So I think the key point you mentioned was the balance of power and the imbalance that's in Israel-Palestine, which alludes to the fact that oftentimes, a law submits to power. A law is an instrument of power. And I think Israel-Palestine probably demonstrates that more than any other conflict. So given that's the fact, I mean, and another key aspect of conflict resolution is to have a common reference. We are in a situation where there is no common reference when it comes, well, there's a different narrative. Israel constantly portrays a different narrative. It does not accept the international legal paradigm as a framework for resolving the conflict. It consistently wants US intervention, US to play a role, which again pushes the Israel-Palestine conflict into the power dynamics rather than what is right, what is wrong. So that in itself is a major issue. A simple example, as I mentioned before, is the refugee issue. Everyone under international law, refugees have a right to return, but Israel persistently resists that. So given that, there's a different narrative, there's this balance of power issue that comes into it, how useful do you think adding another layer of understanding from an Islamic framework, what are you trying to achieve here? What does that add to our understanding of how it could help us resolve not just Israel-Palestine conflict, other conflict? What is it that you're trying to achieve here?
I think it's very important that that the audience is clear here in terms of what I'm alluding to. But when I say, Islamic peacekeeping or Islamic law, I'm not suggesting that this is going to supersede the existing landscape in any way or form. What I'm saying is that we have, even look like globally in recent years, we have a situation where groups come along and use the tools or the name of religiosity to justify what they're doing. So just classic is we go to Syria and we have Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, which has been debunked by all the classical scholars, as a, in terms of the polity that they're trying to create. It's, it's got no legitimacy, basically. And similarly, you have these kind of groups now emerging in multiple theaters who don't openly, obviously use politics, interface with religiosity to justify what they're doing. And yet the normative majority of the people of those faith adherents would totally disregard that and say they got it's got nothing to do with faith. And so that's one thing I want to make clear to the audience. And then you come to obviously the ground political realities out there. So what the model which I've kind of been looking into and suggesting is that what that looks at is acts as a check and balance. So any actor who is acting in using this kind of behavior will be pretty much checked in and say, you have no grounds. And how that can happen is that even with some of these extreme right-wing groups, and be they political, but they are very often using religious undertones to justify what they're doing. So if you have the senior rabbis, senior council, senior shayukh, senior clergy, who are able to, put them in check based on their, classical understanding of their traditions, and then there will be the international, repercussions and reprimand for what they're doing, then hopefully that can make such groups and bodies think twice before they engage in such behavior. A classic example I could give is in one of the obviously theaters which I wrote in my book is the situation in Kashmir. And what we have in South Asia is the Hindutva movement, on the auspices of the RSS. Yet you speak to mainstream majority Hindu people, they will say it's got nothing to do with our faith, but it's been but the name of religiosity is being politicized in a manner which is leading to destruction, pillage, attacking the other, leading to hate, division, discord, etc., etc. So that's the point I'm making. So any groups in these conflict theaters that are engaged in activity of such magnitude, this is where the model which I'm talking about can act as a check and balance. And I can allude to it a bit further in terms of how I feel it could work.
Yes, so I was going to ask you, that was going to be my next question. I mean, given that you're speaking about a model for conflict resolution, and you've looked at history, I mean, can you cite a few examples, any from recent history or from the past, to show how the framework and the principles which you're alluding to has actually achieved peace and resolved conflict?
I think one thing I would like to just touch on this point is that when I looked into my book, as we talk, we'd like to use terms of, Islamic or international or etc. But when I studied these two systems, you realize the high-rise principles are synergized across both systems. So, example being human rights, the fundamental human rights that exist in Islamic law. Hukuk Allah, hukuk al-ibad, the rights of man, the rights of God to right to others. The principle of humanity.
Non-targeting of civilians is another example.
Indiscriminate killing of innocents is not allowed. The treatment of prisoners of war. And some of the key differences around the dignity of the dead, the right to a speedy burial. This is something in the faith traditions which is, sacrosanct, and you have to ensure that this is done. And then the misabuse of prisoners of war, which we saw sometimes historically in like Abu Ghraib, in Iraq, this would be just uncalled for. It's just unethical, not allowed, within the tenets. So there's a lot of synergies there in terms of the model itself. And to answer your question to the examples, I mean, although they were not overtly Islamic as such in terms of contemporary scenarios, you could look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And what you had a situation there where people were coming out and acknowledging their mistakes openly, that and then there was the principle of forgiveness and reconciliation, and that's where there is a difference in terms of what sometimes the international system and what you could call the Islamic legal structure is, that it's based on restorative justice, whereas a lot of the time the international system may be based on retributive justice, that somebody's done a wrong to me, okay, I need to go and get payback. Whereas the faith-based paradigm would look at, okay, how do we reconcile this? How do we bring about healing? And that's where forgiveness, etc., comes in. So the model I'm talking about is that, yes, you still have the diplomats there, you still have the intellectuals there, you still have the politicians there, but there is a role for faith-based actors in this interlocutory process, and they should not be totally disregarded from the equation. So that's the point I'm making. And these will be people of senior authority who are, recognized, of high repute from across the faith traditions and from different denominations. So when they speak, they have the authority, and people will take heed. It does raise the question, which is the caveat to this, is that a lot of these non-state actors and groups, especially those that are inclined to, terrorism, etc., one of their kind of modus operandi is a total disregard for authority, and that's how they operate. So all of a sudden, you could argue, well, how is this going to work when they don't, respect any authority? But I think we live in a global age and a global media age. The international condemnation such groups will get, if they are using, based on these, whatever they may be doing to the pillage and destruction, that hopefully would act as a check and balance also. And there may be occasions, sometimes in this body that you will have people who are, it's not going to be a talking shop. We have a lot of these talking shops globally, sadly, in different guises. But there will be people whom you may not agree with wholeheartedly, but they seem to have authority for certain groups. So they will still feature in there. And by them making a statement through a collective consensus, which is ijma, again, principles of Islamic jurisprudence, that there may be a probability and a likelihood that it could sway things in a different way than not so. So let's just take it in another way. If we say we don't have these people as part of the canopy of brokering disputes, does that help or does that hinder? Well, my argument is that, well, it's good to have them at your disposal, because by having them at your disposal, you can bring them in a subsidiarity, contextual circumstance, wherever the need arises, use the expertise, and there's a strong likelihood they may act as a check and balance to anything that is going to happen that could lead to further destruction, damage, pillage, etc., etc. So that's the argument I'm making. So it's not like a either or. And this is something when I spoke to a lot of the interlocutors or people who are engaged in space, and they were categorical. An absolutist model does not work. It won't work, especially the area which we're discussing, which is Palestine-Israel. It has to be based on rights. It has to be based on justice and citizenship, and ensuring people are given the freedom of movement, which is not happening at the moment. These are fundamental tenets, and you have to start at that ground level before anything can move thereafter.
Yeah, I think one of the important things you alluded to is the fact that there are traditions which can help guide and resolve conflicts, and a lot of times what we see is that narrow political ideals, ethno-nationalism, actually subordinates long traditions, whether it be Judaism and various other traditions. Of course, many of the practices of Israel would be condemned by Jewish traditions, and many rabbis do that.
That's the point. That is the
point. But at the same time, as you know, there's the issue here is that Israel has a position, office of the chief rabbi. So a lot of times what you see is that you can say there's a co-option of religion, as we see in Israel and elsewhere. There's a co-option of religion to legitimize and justify the policies of the state. So yes, we would like to see, in some sense, subordination of some of the narrow ideals and goals to a more universalist tradition, which is where international law is supposed to come in. International law kind of represents the universal principles and values. And I think if you cannot solve any conflict through those universal values, then that's a failing on the part of all the actors. And there is something else at play here: interest, narrow self-interest, bigotry, political expediency, whatever you want to bring into it. So, but how do you do that? I mean, even if you take the Muslim world as an example, you would say narrow political interest has subordinated some of the other more moral, ethical considerations which come from our tradition. It's a difficult sell, isn't it? I mean, you do see examples of where, even in the Muslim world, where the state, like UAE, for example, is trying to co-opt religious figures to advance its political ideas and interests. But doing the reverse, where you have universal religious ideals subordinating or informing narrow political actors, that's a really tough sell in this day and age, don't you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question, especially in the kind of multipolar world that we live in, and the dynamics between the global south and the West at large. The realignments that are taking place now. These raises additional questions, and I think one of the points we talk about is the principle of independence and autonomy. So if a lot of these countries, where even if they are religious representatives who are pretty much on the lead of the political apparatus in terms of what they say and what they say in the sermons, then that's not going to be of benefit to nobody. But what the model which I talk about, especially as you alluded to at the international fora, and the term I use for is an International Peace and Reconciliation Council, where you would have representatives of these diverse spectrum, is that they will have that independence and autonomy. They will not be subjugated by the whims of a leader or an autocrat, etc., where the life is on the line, etc. So then, when they make the judgments, it will be based on that classical reasoning, their understanding, their speciality and expertise, without any political favor, etc., etc. And so that's something which that independence and neutrality of the model hopefully will be able to be sustained, over the peace, rather than something that's just short-lived. So that's the way I feel like that. I counter that. Just for the benefit of your audience, I mean, I use just to kind of explain what I mean by theodiplomacy. I can give you the definition I give in my book is theodiplomacy is an approach wherein the interlocutors and advisors of the parties to a situation of conflict have religious literacy, appreciation, and understanding of the contextual sensitivities of the conflict to help facilitate a pathway towards peace and reconciliation. So that's what it is. It's about, a lot of times it's ignorance. A lot of these conflicts are down to ignorance. And when you are able to, get rid of that ignorance, you are, shedding light on something whereby the pathway towards facilitating a speed of resolution is there. So that's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one final question. So what is your general advice or recommendation when looking at conflicts? Is there a universal model which you can suggest for creating peace? Is that something you have at the end of your book in your summary?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, one thing I would say, these are my thoughts, and it doesn't mean to say that these will work in practice, but it's something which I've explored and looked into. And the model which I talk about, which I briefly just touched on, is an International Peace and Reconciliation Council model, and that needs to be at the United Nations level. So a bit like we have the United Nations Security Council today, and or the United Nations structure, you have many multiple states that have to submit and adhere to it. All the member states will have to assign to this council to show that they agree to its modalities and its jurisdictional remit. And then as part of that, in the peace and reconciliation process, one thing which I talk about is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and that talks about the fundamental human rights. It talks about the right to education. It talks about sustainable peace, United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 16, and things like, I mean, just to give you an example in terms of how this could work, is we have groups today like the Taliban in Afghanistan who are not allowing women the right to education. Well, that's straight away, if you are using it's a political organization, but if they're using religious, religious analysis or justification
references,
it's not allowed. This would be categorically checked by the body of the nature that I'm mentioning straight away. So they will get international condemnation, reprimand, and they'll be checked straight away. And through classical authorities, so it could be the Sheikh of Jamil Azhar, it could be senior Sheikh from Al Qum, and similarly from different faith traditions. So this is how I see that working. And then one of the roles important in this is the role of women, which is often neglected in the peace and reconciliation process, and that's something which is also important to be as part of this framework. And as I mentioned, it has to have legally binding authority within the framework of the United Nations. So it can't be just some talking shop around on the sideshow. It has to have the political leverage and weight that when they make decisions and things move and people take heed of what it refers to there. And then I think finally what I would say is that is the principle of humanity and the collectivism, which is which we, even from an Islamic legal perspective, we talk about the maqasid of Sharia, and ultimately what is intertwined.
Objectives of Islamic law.
Yeah. So this is something which is humanitarianism, which is synergized between not only Islamic law but international law and good faith actors around the world. So a body of this nature will be inclined, and the direction of travel will be always orientated towards towards peace, as opposed to any ulterior motive, which we just alluded to already in our conversation about the real politics, the ulterior motives of clinging on to power, etc. So that's something which I feel can work, and it's based on principles of justice, human rights, humanity, etc., which I talked about. And I think that is the way forward. And by using absolutist paradigms, in the world that we live in today, it doesn't always work. However, what my book does cover is that there are certain situations where jurisdictionally people obviously follow these rules, and adhere to them, in a very strict manner. So if you are able to cite sources and authority in those situations for those parties, that can definitely help as a facilitative tool. And then finally, third-party actors. This is something which is, again, part of the Islamic peacekeeping model, to always have neutral.
So on that, sorry, just on that final question on that. So do you think, I mean, we should empower organizations like the OIC, Organization Islamic Conference, which is part of the UN body as well, and maybe get a Jewish organization similar to the OIC, or a Christian organization? Is that something you speak about in your book, that religious bodies like the OIC should be given a much higher status and a role? Likewise, bring in other religious non-state actors like the OIC
Indeed.
within the United Nations framework to provide better guidance and better guidance on informing the conflict.
The spot on. So that's something which I do touch on in my book, and it's about giving that counsel and sincere advice, which we alluded to. So in the recent years, we've had the Common Word Initiative, which was which took place between different faith traditions, again based on similar principles around bringing different faith groups together and looking at certain conflicts around the world and how we can address them. Just more recently, we had the Charter of Mecca, the Mecca Declaration, again bringing different faith groups together to look at and provide pathways towards solutions for some of our global challenges. And as part of that, it includes conflict. So I think the point that I wish the book I'm making is that we can have a world where you don't engage faith-based actors. There are bad faith actors out there, of course, or we can have a situation where the wisdom and counsel that these people bring, can be used effectively as part of the facilitative tool. And it's granted it ain't going to work always, but to have that at the disposal, I think it's something that will enhance the pathways towards peace and reconciliation, as opposed to act as a counter to that. So that's the point I'm making here.
And it's a good point to end on, Kaleem. I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you who tuned in at home to listen to our podcast, MEMO in Conversation. See you in another conversation next week. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.